A man bought a new house with a lot of property, but it was adjacent to a landfill which was clearly visible from the house. And it was a terrible view, so the man planted a tree to block that view. And then on the opposite end of his property, there was a stream. But there wasn't any shade over there, so he planted a tree there too, so he could sit by the stream under the shade and just enjoy nature. Well, as the two trees grew, they both bloomed and bore fruit. And the farmer went to the tree closest to his house, the tree that he planted to block the view of the landfill, and he gathered the fruit. And he noticed it looked like a little deformed. It looked a little weird. But he still figured it was edible, so he took it in the house and saved it for later. Later that evening, he was sitting on his porch, and he took one of the pieces of fruit. But when he bit into it, he discovered that it was extremely bitter, completely inedible. So he threw it away, walked across his property, and went to the other tree and took a piece of its fruit and bit into it. And it was sweet and delicious, so he gathered some more and took them to the house. It all came down to the tree's location, where its roots were getting their nutrition. The Bible is also a tale of two trees. It began that way, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. There was a choice to be made. Adam and Eve chose the wrong tree and lost their access to the tree of life. Well, it's not about the literal trees anymore, but the choice is still there. Do we choose God and the values of His kingdom, or do we choose ourselves and the ways of the world? The Bible is full of people who made the wrong choice. And the world is full of people who made the wrong choice. But we still have the opportunity to make the right choice. This morning we're going to be in Matthew 7, where Jesus closes His Sermon on the Mount by highlighting that choice and calling us to make the right choice. And to do this, He uses three metaphors, one of which is another tale of two trees. I will warn you, Jesus uses that metaphor a little bit differently than I'm using it, so I'll explain those differences as we go to avoid confusion. But I want to look at these three metaphors and how they each show a different factor of this choice. So let's go ahead and read verses 13 through 27 of Matthew chapter 7. Enter by the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the way is easy that leads to destruction. And those who enter by it are many. For the gate is narrow and the way is hard that leads to life, and those who find it are few. Beware of false prophets, who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. You will recognize them by their fruits. Are grapes gathered from thorn bushes, or figs from thistles? So every healthy tree bears good fruit, but the diseased tree bears bad fruit. A healthy tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a diseased tree bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus you will recognize them by their fruits. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. On that day, many people will say to me, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and cast out demons in your name and do many mighty works in your name? And then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness. Everyone then who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, but it did not fall, because it had been founded on the rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell, and great was the fall of it. So Jesus talks about these three aspects of the choice we have to make, and first we must choose our path. There's a wide gate, and there's a narrow gate. The wide gate is an easy path, so most people go that way. But it doesn't lead to the right place. The narrow gate, on the other hand, leads to the right place, but not many people go that way because it's so difficult. Well, if one leads to the right place and the other doesn't, it seems like it would be an easy and obvious choice. But Jesus wouldn't have brought it up if it really were, if people so easily took the correct path. Even the people who profess to choose the right path often still end up on the wrong one, because it's so easy to end up on that wrong path. And so Jesus is saying we need to pay close attention and wisely choose our path. And then he says we must choose our master. He gives a warning in verses 15 through 20 about false teachers, false prophets. He tells us to beware of them, watching carefully for them, and he tells us how to recognize them so that we can avoid them and defend ourselves against them. He says we need to examine their fruit. Is it good or bad? Because a bad tree can't produce good fruit, and a good tree can't produce bad fruit, Jesus says. So we need to watch out for their fruit so that we choose our master, our teachers, wisely. This is actually backwards from the way disciple-making worked in first century Judaism. This is how Jesus made disciples and how Christians made disciples. But Jesus wasn't the only or the first person to make disciples. All rabbis had disciples, and disciples eventually became rabbis themselves and raised up their own disciples. But the disciple candidates would go to school. They would learn all about the Old Testament, all about the law. They would learn about all the traditions of the elders and the Pharisees. And then they would submit applications. They would apply to all the various rabbis, kind of like they would a job, and they would show their resume essentially. They would talk about their education and their training, and they would hope that a rabbi would pick them. They might apply to lots of different rabbis, but the rabbi chose the disciples. Jesus, on the other hand, calls everyone to be his disciple. Remember the Great Commission, make disciples of all nations. He's not looking at our resumes. In fact, he's looking past our resumes and calling us anyway. We've already been chosen and called. The choice then is ours. Jesus isn't looking at our resume. He's saying to look at the teacher's resume. And that's what matters. And it matters because disciples are not just expected to learn information from their rabbi. They're expected to live as the rabbi lives and mimic the rabbi's behavior and go where the rabbi goes. You're supposed to be like your rabbi. So Jesus says we need to choose our master, our rabbi, carefully. Look at their fruit. Who do you want to be like? Who will lead you to be more like God? Are we going to choose Jesus as our master and teacher, or are we going to follow someone else? Are we going to follow the ways of the world? And then the third part of this choice, skipping down to verses 24 through 27, he also says we must choose our foundation. There's sand and there's solid rock. And again, that seems like an easy and obvious choice, but it's really not. It's easy when we're looking at the metaphor, but when Jesus tells us what the metaphor means, it becomes a lot harder to actually do. The rock is the teachings of Jesus. If we obey him, we're building on that rock, but if we don't obey, we're building on sand. And it's obvious that we should build on the rock, but then it's a lot harder for us to actually live as Jesus taught and lived. And I know I skipped over verses 21 through 23, so let's go back to those right quick now that we've looked at the three parts of this choice. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, he says. You know, those are popular verses in the churches of Christ. Those are the verses a lot of people use to say that many people who claim to be Christians aren't going to be going to heaven. But Jesus didn't give us those words for that purpose. Jesus didn't give us these verses as ammunition against other people. These are not rocks to be thrown at sinners. Remember, in our text last week, Jesus told us to put those rocks down and take a closer look at ourselves. And that's what Jesus is calling us to do in these verses. These are not words of judgment as we often use them. They are a call for us to examine our lives. He used the tree metaphor to talk about our teachers, but we need to use it to think about ourselves too. Are we producing good fruit, showing that we've chosen the right path and the right foundation and the right teacher, or are we producing bad fruit, meaning that we've made all the wrong choices? And I want to go back to that tree metaphor, but I want to use it differently than Jesus did. When Jesus talked about the tree, he was talking more about false prophets, not so much us. But he is talking about us in the rest of that passage, and we need to examine ourselves too. But while the tree represents the teachers in his metaphor, we are not the tree. I think that's what we miss. We're not really the tree. Jesus is the tree. The teachers he's talking about are the trees. As Jesus said in John 15:5, I am the vine, you are the branches. And so the question is not, what kind of tree are we? But rather, which tree are we a part of? Which path did we follow? What master have we grafted ourselves to? Where have we put down our roots? Are we a part of the Jesus tree producing Jesus fruit? Or are we part of the worldly tree producing worldly fruit? This isn't just a one-time choice, though. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven. Not everyone who has professed Jesus as Lord at some point will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. It starts with our profession, but we have to follow through with our actions. So our walk with God is not just a one-time decision, but it's a daily commitment. In Matthew 21, Jesus told a parable about two sons. Their father went to each of them and told them to go work in the vineyard. And the first refused. But later he went and did the work. The second son agreed, but he didn't actually go. And the point of this parable is that the words are meaningless. They're important, but they don't really mean that much. The initial choice is meaningless. It's important, but it's not as important as what you do after. What matters is the continued commitment which is demonstrated through our actions. And so our walk with God is not just a one-time decision, it's a daily commitment. It's a daily following through what we profess. But as we learn in that parable in Matthew 21, it's not too late. Maybe you didn't obey at first, but it's not too late. So maybe this morning you need to take that first step and make the commitment, professing your faith in Jesus as Lord, rooting yourself in Him. Maybe you made that decision a long time ago, but you haven't been fully committed. You haven't been following through on that profession. We want to help get you on the right path this morning. If you have a need of any kind, will you come as we stand and sing?